One, two, three, take one. All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Bilal. I'm an 8th year MD PhD student at Johns Hopkins.
I'm Vineet Tiravati. I'm a 9th year MD PhD student at Emory and Georgia Tech.
My name is John William Sidholm, and I'm also an 8th year student at Hopkins.
And the topic that we wanted to discuss today, essentially in a conversational format here, is to discuss the idea of the differential diagnosis and maybe try to break it apart in terms of what it means from various statistical frameworks. But to me, a natural way to start this conversation is to really ask what does the differential diagnosis truly mean in terms of what it gives you in your ability to make decisions about patients and provide them the best care. And for me, in thinking about this problem, I think the kind of clear insight came from thinking about philosophy of science. Right, so there's this problem in the way that we do science, and quite frankly, it's a cognitive bias. I think that just has existed in humanity forever, and it's that we have a tendency to want to find confirmatory evidence. Right, I think this, therefore, I'm going to look for evidence for that. Right, but one of the first things that we're taught when we're on the wards, and I think one of the most valuable things, and it's a hard thing to get out of, is the idea that once you think you've nailed the answer, you never close the door on alternatives. All right. And so why would that necessarily be important? If I really think that this patient has diabetes, right, and I'm like absolutely convinced, why should I worry about other hypotheses? And so it turns out in kind of philosophy of science, the way that they've addressed this issue of getting past confirmatory testing and not closing the door. So first of all, the reason that you don't want to do that kind of work is it's been known for a while that you can never confirm a hypothesis, you can only falsify. All right, you can only say, I definitely know it's not this, but among all the things that are left, right, any one of them, maybe one's more likely than another, but like I can't tell you for a fact that one of these things is true. And so a really powerful idea that's emerged in philosophy of science is the idea of either multiple hypothesis testing or strong inference. And really one of the nice things about the idea of strong inference is you hold in your mind two or more explanations for the thing that you see in front of you. And the really critical thing is that you make decisions that essentially sharpen the boundaries between these different explanations.
Bilal, can you explain a little more what you mean by strong inference?
Yeah, so the idea of strong inference, so it's this really easy to read paper by, I think, John Platt. Not sure, I have maybe the year's 1964 in science. So the idea is rather than, and I'll give an example here, but rather than if I think, let's say I think a patient has a particular disorder, the naive way of approaching this problem is, oh, okay, I think that I'm going to think of one reason. Let's just say I already brought up the example of diabetes. And so because I have diabetes in my mind, all I'm going to do are tests that will put me down the diabetes route. I'm going to do an HbA1c, right? I might do fasting glucose, so on, so on. The problem becomes, what do you do? Right. What do you do when potentially it's not so clear that that's the only explanation for what you have? And so the idea of strong inference. So what Platt did in the 60s, he recognized that the fields of, I think, molecular biology at the time in physics were moving. They were outpacing other fields like psychology, and I think maybe chemistry. He mentioned as another example. They're outpacing those fields. And so he said, what are they doing that these other fields aren't doing? And he said, what they're doing really well is they're coming up with multiple potential explanations for the thing that they see. And then they're designing experiments that essentially serve to highlight the contrast between their explanations.
You know what this kind of reminds me of, just to bring an analogy to some of the machine learning stuff, right? When you train models in like 1v-all fashions, right? The feature space that is learned can be very limited if you train in a 1v-all fashion. When you train models in multi-class, you find that the learned features become far more rich and far more descriptive, because the model is now encouraged to learn not just one versus everything else, but to learn the distinguishing features of every class. So maybe the example here is a model trained to be diabetes versus all other endocrine problems versus a model trained to learn all endocrine problems will learn a more rich feature space between the different endocrine problems, and thus give you a better definition of what it means to be diabetes versus, you know, a problem with PTH or a different endocrine axis. Maybe that's something that.
Yeah. So one thing that's helped me kind of center the whole idea of strong inference, especially strong inference, was one of those things that really, I think, empowered my ability to do science, but also has empowered my growing, hopeful ability to do medicine. What is our goal, right? Scientists, engineers, physicians all have very similar goals in some respects. The goal is, what's happening here? Here's the thing. I need to know what's happening here. What is it? What's it doing? How does it do its thing? And the predominant, what Platt was discussing with the strong inference was an alternative to the reductionist approach of, let's break this thing apart and see how each piece interacts with each other. The strong inference contrast is, let's build an understanding of how all the pieces come together and work, and then try different versions of the whole system's. I'm trying to test my understanding of that system. I'm trying to test, for example, a car. That's my always go-to analogy. If I'm trying to understand a car, I'm not going to necessarily understand how the gas pedal relates to the screw in the back of my brake, right? I can do a rich test. I could do a really big high-powered test to see if they're related to each other. But it doesn't really tell me how the car's working. So, I guess just recentering it in that context of what is inference? What is the inference that is in strong inference? It's the idea of what we're all trying to do. All of us are trying to do is, I'm trying to make this thing in my head, this understanding in my head, match what's actually happening as close as possible. That's what we all share. Where I think engineers and physicians differ than scientists is, we have an extra imperative on top of that. It's not enough to just understand. In some cases, even without understanding, you have to do something that makes that system behave better, behave in a better way. So strong inference's strength may be in that we're understanding the whole system as best as we can, and then steadily resolving the blurriness in those models versus understanding how each piece interacts with each other, and then trying to piece them all together and kind of have to do entirely new experiments because they all interact with each other. So I don't know if that's helpful, but just to kind of reframe that in the context of where things are aligned, where things are different in these different fields.
That's actually that's really nicely said, right? To come back and define the idea of what inference is. Right. So let me. I think what would be nice for whoever may be listening to this is a real example. I mean, this is going to be an abstract example I'll give. And if you guys have already heard this, just humor me and play along. But I find this as a very useful way, if perhaps a simple way of making it crystal clear how this idea of strong inference is really helpful. And then it should be pretty clear why then the idea of a differential diagnosis is helpful. Okay, so I'm gonna give you guys a job. This is just a quick puzzle game that we're gonna play, okay? So I'm gonna come up with a list of numbers, and then I need you guys, so I want you guys to then give me a number. I'll tell you yes or no that fits the pattern. All right, you get one shot at this. And then what I want you to do is to tell me what the rule for the pattern is, okay? So I'm gonna start it off. The pattern is 2, 4, 6. Okay. And so what don't try to outsmart this. Just like, what is your natural tendency for what is the next number that
9.
comes out of your mouth?
It's 8.
Right. And it's like, right. Your intuition is to tell me 8. I mean, and granted, I'm asking you to do an experiment, right? You're giving me a number where my answer, yes or no, then tells you I am correct about the way that the system here works. Okay, so exactly, most people would say 8. And I think the first time I heard this question, I would have said 8 as well. And so, okay, I would say yes, 8 fits the pattern, right? So John, what is then the pattern? What is the underlying rule?
It's every other number.
Yeah, and I would say, no,
2.
that's not, yeah, I would say
Plus
that's not
2.
the rule.
That's not the rule. It's actually the previous 2 numbers added together.
That's not the rule either.
Okay.
All right. And so let me tell you the strong inference way of having done this, because when you say the next number is 8, what you fall into is the confirmatory trap, right? You hear 2, 4, 6, your mind says, oh, okay, these are even numbers increasing or something like that. Or, I'm going to skip every other number. The problem is, right? Let's think of an alternative. An alternative, and by the way, the actual rule that I had in mind is I'm just giving you a list of increasing numbers. All right, and so now if in my mind, rather than it's just numbers that skip, right? Alternative number 2 is, okay, maybe they're just increasing numbers. You would do what John said originally, which is maybe I'll give you the number 9, right? Because if I give you the number 9, if you give me the number 9 and then I say, yes, that fits my pattern, then automatically, it can't be, even numbers increasing. Right. And that's something that you absolutely would not have made if you're just trying to follow this thing in a
so Bilal,
way.
are you suggesting that the way to go about this is to create the hypothesis and then design the experiment to disprove the hypothesis, as opposed to design the experiment to confirm the hypothesis?
Well, let me actually, if I may, Platt has this concept called crucial experiment. It's a single experiment meant to. This is what Bilal meant with sharp. You want sharp boundaries. You want to design an experiment that is it can't give results that leave multiple hypotheses as still likely. So I like what you said in the beginning. Don't overthink this. What you were saying is come up with other models. You're coming up with alternative models. Like your gut feeling says 8, and you, because I know you, are probably thinking of other relationships that might come up, which is what Platt would say as our list of hypotheses, our multiple hypotheses that we set up, and then we try to design a crucial experiment to differentiate amongst those hypotheses. So I think what John was getting at was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I heard, instead of disproving, you're trying to prove a hypothesis?
Yeah, I think the initial approach was, we hear 2, 4, 6. We assume the model is add 2 or whatever, the even numbers. And so our next experiment is to provide an answer that would confirm our hypothesis, as opposed to providing an answer that would disprove our hypothesis.
So yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say that that's exactly what strong inference is, right? It's building on the idea that if I can't actually prove my hypotheses, I can only disprove them. What strong inference does, in my opinion, is it gives you a very clear roadmap how to implement that. Right? What is a realistic way that I can actually design experiments where I can disprove things? Because if just stated up front, all I can do is disprove, I can't prove it, it feels a little bit empty. And so what I really liked about Platt's approach with strong inference is it gives a clear roadmap on how to implement that. And so basically, just to take that and link it to the idea of the differential diagnosis, I viewed the differential diagnosis as essentially medicine's way of implementing strong inference. All right, because what the differential gives you is here are all possible things, and then the tests you order, and this is where really good attendings, really good residents will really push you, is you need to order tests that are going to help, that are going to rank things on this list, but that are going to help discriminate them. Right? If every single thing I think the patient has is going to result in high blood glucose, all right, that's not going to be that particularly useful to get a blood glucose. Maybe I'll get it anyway because it's useful to have these things as a baseline. right? But it's not going to be useful in helping discriminate. And so that's kind of where I was getting at here. And I think, right, if you wanted to get into it deeply, right, I think it does get into really thorny issues about what it means to kind of prove or disprove things. But I wanted to bring this up and tie it to philosophy of science, just to say that I think the idea of the differential is really, I think at its core, has to do with exactly what you brought up, John, that you don't prove things, you can only disprove things, with then strong inference just being a particular way to make that thing, that idea come to life.
That's a great, I like that. I mean, I wasn't so versed in strong inference, at least in the sense that how it's being defined here, but I can definitely see the value of it definitely in science and medicine, in machine learning. And like it seems to be a very ubiquitous tool that is just broadly applicable when it comes to, I mean, I guess most of life, in the sense of trying to figure out what's going on. So I think it's a great way to, I think, maybe frame moving into how we apply strong inference in clinical medicine.
Exactly. I think we do it implicitly in the HPI, right? The history of present illness, this kind of first step we have with our patients. It's an adaptive process. It should be an adaptive process where I start out at chief complaint. What's the one thing bringing you here, right? They give a chief complaint. Patient gives a chief complaint, and then we build a map, right? We build a map, and how we build that map depends on which stage of training we're at. If we're early in our training, we build a map based off of the textbooks because they teach us things. And there's issues today where the textbooks teach us more esoteric things that we'll never see because they're trying to differentiate people's skills. That's a whole nother topic we'll have later. But what you're using to build that initial landscape helps determine which direction you want to go. It determines your next experiment, right? So a chief complaint shows up. You should have a list of hypotheses. Importantly, just because it's not on that list doesn't mean you should ignore it, because that's just a chief complaint. There are things that the likelihood of, and we'll get to likelihood in a second, I imagine, the likelihood that one of your first diseases is what's happening with the patient is pretty low if you're at our training level. So you want to start with 4 and you want to use it to design your experiments, but you don't want to close yourself off to other hypotheses. So that's where the challenge becomes, I think, a little bit outside of strong inference. Strong inference is a piece of it, which is how do you design experiments to differentiate between hypotheses? How do you form those hypotheses? And then we start getting into a lot of the fun of clinical reasoning, which is how do you swap these around and rank them around? How do you use the fact that your new first hypothesis, how do you design the next question for your patient that addresses what it gets at, to then address in medical terms, but also non-medical terms, the actual data that you're trying to get? So I think in a practical sense, the HPI really exhibits elements of strong inference. It also exhibits elements of frequentist statistics, which we'll get into, and hopefully one of y'all will define. And it gets finally into a little bit of Bayesian. How do you construct, how do you formally talk about the knowledge that you're coming into a situation with? And then how do you formally, rigorously update that knowledge? These are the kind of approaches that we can talk about in a concrete way.
Great. I think that's, and I know at least at Hopkins, internal medicine is taught this way. Very much, at least how it's taught here, is that, you know, even before you walk into a patient's room, you normally have looked at the chart, right? And you have a hypothesis. And then you walk in the room and then you try to test the hypothesis with your HPI, right? That's why you ask certain questions. I think as an M1, you're taught the HPI in a very different way. Yeah. You're taught very open-ended questions, just be a documenter of the facts. And then when you document the story and the facts, then walk out of the room and think. The problem is you quickly find, and I found on internal medicine, if you were too open, and of course I was early, so I was trying to implement, you know, reasoning through my HPI, but it's hard to think on the fly as an M3 and you're, early on, like, what is my hypothesis? What is the map, and have it all on the fly, right? Yeah. So I'd leave the room often, and I would often find myself running back in the room to ask questions. Mm-hmm. Like I would step outside, I'd start writing the note, and I get the assessment and plan. And as I'm walking through the assessment and plan, I'm like, I should have asked that question, because that's part of my my differential relies on knowing the answer to that question. So I would jump right back in the room, like put my head back in and be like, by the way, did you mention that your diet was, was it low salt, whatever it was, right? And I'd be like, okay, if it was not, that really helps me understand. So I think in medical school, I was actually surprised that I never heard about this approach in the HPI until I got into third year. Yeah. In first and second year, no one ever really talked to us about how to craft the HPI or the history taking portion in a way that is testing a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. And I think this gets at the idea of what makes actually being a physician so much different than the way that you learn if most of what you do is study for step one or any of these standardized exams. Is right. Imagine that you're trying to test. You have a patient in front of you, and all you have is kind of the knowledge base that comes with studying for step one, right? Then the only questions you can ask are really buzzword questions that, I know one fact about this one disease, and it's a unique fact of that one disease. So I'm going to ask them this one question. It's incredible. It's inefficient. It's mentally taxing. And quite frankly, it doesn't work in as I think we'll talk about in a Bayesian way, which is you want to rank things in terms of how common they might be for this patient. Common things being common is the questions you want to ask. Presumably you work your way down from the thing that's most likely to affect your patient to the things that are less likely to affect them.
Go ahead. One thing I would like to clarify about that part is one way of constructing your prior. So what we're starting to get at is priors. What are we coming into a situation knowing, right? One way of constructing it is what's most common is common, right? I forget the exact phrasing. So that is definitely, so it's, I think medical education is doing a good job of addressing that type of, go look at the data, see what's happening more often, and come into a situation with in mind that cardiovascular disease is kind of everywhere, asthma is kind of everywhere. So keep these hypotheses in the front of your mind before walking into the room, right? Mm-hmm. What I liked about John's example was, in the real world, we look at the chart, right? So common things being common is nice, but if the chart says it's this rare disease, right? You're coming in probably weighing that rare disease more, not because it's common things being more common, but because someone else seems to have done work and deduced that this is the case. The problem is, and most Bayesian priors are not, priors being, the probability of something being the case. Most people then get fixated on that diagnosis, someone else's diagnosis being this thing. You come in, you limit yourself to that hypothesis, and you ask only questions related to that hypothesis. But these priors, in math we call it, not a finite support. You gotta keep other things still in mind. You gotta keep, yes, someone mentioned that it could be atrial myxoma, some pretty rare thing that relates to the heart and being short of breath. It could be that, and someone wrote on this chart it's that. It's not very common, but someone wrote on the chart it's that. So I'm going to go in, ask questions about that, but I'm not going to artificially limit only to that. I'm going to ask one or two questions that are outside that as well to see if some other hypothesis, one of the common things being common, is a more likely explanation of it. So I guess, yeah.
So maybe we can, because we're kind of dancing around some of these topics more formally. Like, I think we're throwing out some Bayesian ideas. We're touching upon strong inference. I think we defined that pretty well, right? And then maybe we can talk now about how just to formalize our discussion. Three ways of using data. You know, so when we say inference, we mean inference is the method of taking observational data and then coming to a conclusion of what is happening. What is the process? What is the phenomena that is generating the observation? Correct. That's what a statistical model attempts to do. It attempts to discover the data generating process, right? And so there are multiple approaches to how one can do statistical inference, right? And I know today we may discuss 3 approaches, and if we could go through each one and just do a definition of each one in a clinical medicine sense, with an example in clinical medicine, so people can understand it as we go apply it now in the clinical realm.
So what might be helpful is each of us try to go through the 3. So the 3 that we'll be talking about, one of them we've already kind of briefly touched, but let's go through each one and talk about what it means to us and how we see it, because there is wiggle room here. There's frequentist approaches, which I think is what most medical students and medical professionals are most familiar with. There's likelihoodist, which is where you're trying to see what's generating your data, but you're still really, really kind of tied to how likely am I to see this. And then Bayesian. So I guess I'm already kind of doing it, but frequentist really is about data, right? It's about, I'm going to learn what's generating this data by doing this experiment as many times as possible, seeing how many times it shows up this option. I'm going to flip a coin and I'm going to flip it 100 times to see how many times it ends up heads, how many times it ends up tails. And that will then tell me the probability that the coin becomes heads or tails. So if I flip it once, it's an insufficient sample size. I need more to get an idea of how frequently I see each of these outcomes. And so seeing just one outcome is not enough. There's a different, which is likelihoodist. Here you're saying, what's the probability of me seeing this data given this model versus the probability of seeing the same data given this other model. So there you're doing model comparison with a fixed amount of data. So for example, we're going to flip the coin 10 times. It's still not 100. I don't have enough to really see much, but I'm going to flip it 10 times and I see 10 heads. 10 heads, flipping it 10 times. That's a little bit interesting. What's the probability of me seeing that given it's a fair coin, given over the probability of seeing that given it's a not fair coin? You can calculate that explicitly. And that's what a likelihoodist tries to do, is they try to calculate the ratios of explanations, even if a single one of those explanations doesn't fully account for things. And then finally, what a Bayesian does is they don't necessarily compare one model to another model. What a Bayesian, in my mind, does is come in with an understanding, look at the data, and in a formal, rigorous way, update what they came in with to be more consistent with the data they just saw. And and the beauty and the problem with the Bayesian approach is very much, there's a lot of knobs. There's a lot of possible ways to adjust your prior, what you're coming into the situation with. There's a lot of ways to adjust it based off of what you see. And we as physicians have to deal with this all the time. As physicians in training have to deal with this some of the times, where we see a lab result and we, is that the lab result, or is something happening? Did someone get mixed up in it? So I'll pause and I don't know what you.
I'll kind of start off and at least draw a contrast in my mind between the frequentist and the Bayesian perspective. Right, and I guess this kind of touches on the thing we've been talking about this whole time, which is contrasts between your various definitions, your various explanations is what gives you the clearest idea of what they really mean. One of the really beautiful things about the Bayesian approach, and in a very kind of pure way, people typically, when they think of Bayesian reasoning, they think of priors, right? The prior is what makes Bayesian reasoning so unique. But it's not really so much the prior as it's a statistical framework that very naturally formalizes the idea of uncertainty, right? And uncertainty is a cornerstone of so much of decision making, and it's especially a cornerstone of medicine, where, you know, for the most part, you're uncertain about many of your patients most of the time. You're always, you know, wondering, did they get the differential right? Let's see how they respond to this medication. Based on how they respond to the medication, then I'm going to come back and refine. That kind of uncertainty, it's kind of, in order to introduce that into the frequentist approach, it's a bit of a backdoor, right? If you ask people, okay, well, define for me what a confidence interval means. I mean, honestly, it is a confusing thing to try to define. You look in the literature and people have debates with one another about exactly what does a confidence interval actually mean. And it's, the idea of uncertainty is so, I don't know, it's almost alien to the frequentist approach. So to me, that is one of the ways in which they differ. I mean, clearly I'm coming across as a Bayesian. But I think, you know, you can't throw away this idea of uncertainty, right? It's like, as I flip the coin, right, my certainty about an outcome is just as important as, you know, what I think the underlying probability is.
Well, I think maybe if I could ask a question here. I mean, in a frequentist approach, there are ways to quantify uncertainty that are related to the number of trials, or the number of times you test the model, right? Or, you know, you observe the data, correct?
Yeah.
So I guess maybe can you just explain a little more how a Bayesian approach does a better job of quantifying uncertainty over a frequentist approach of quantifying uncertainty?
Right. So the issue with the frequentist approach, right? Let's take the example of flipping the coin. In general, so I'm just gonna go with like the most easy the most often used ways that these approaches are used. Right, with frequentist, if I'm flipping a coin, what I'm saying is, oh, okay, I think the probability of heads is 0.52, just given the information that I have. And then what I can generate is a confidence interval about how confident I am that it is 0.52. And so, and without getting into the details, even this idea of what it means to come up with the confidence interval, it's not intuitive in the least. Whereas with the Bayesian approach, you would represent the full distribution over coin probabilities, right? So the coin can be totally weighted to tails, it can be totally weighted to heads, or it could be anything in between, right? And you come into it with a prior that this is probably a fair coin, right? And I think most of us, you know, the idea of a prior is not this vague, abstract notion. It's like most coins that I see in real life, I'm pretty sure are fair coins. And so what you do is you flip it, is you say, oh, okay, what is the probability that the underlying, say how fair is this coin given the outcomes that I've seen? And you're able to represent the entire distribution that way and very quickly see how certain or uncertain I am about an outcome, rather than having to do this extra bit of machinery called the confidence interval. So that to me, I mean, yes, you can try to quantify uncertainty in the frequentist approach, but it's not a natural consequence of the framework. It's something you need to add on after the fact.
John, I don't. What are your kind of overall perspectives on the three?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I think about frequentist versus Bayesian approaches as it pertains to clinical medicine, and maybe we can bring this back to kind of how us as learners versus more advanced clinicians implement inference, is, you know, what's interesting is early on in your career as a learner, you use data generated from, often we use RCTs, randomized controlled trials, right? Which in medicine are the gold standards for doing any intervention in clinical medicine, right? And on the wards, it's such a big deal if you can cite the RCTs, the really key ones in internal medicine that tested this diuretic versus that diuretic, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then use that, and that is called evidence-based medicine, because you're using highly rigorous, you know, studies to justify your decision-making. Now that data is, RCTs are assume come in with not saying no prior, but they come in with how would you describe this? The prior is on
assumptions.
Right? But it comes in with no assumptions, right? The RCT says we are going to, or it assumes that the likelihood or the effect of this versus that is equal, is unknown.
So I don't mean to, I'll just say this real quick. It makes an assumption that your observations are IID, independent and identically distributed. That's an implicit assumption.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
Makes. And it makes the assumption that your confounds are distributed in a certain way. It makes the assumption that your sample size is large enough that you're overcoming the confound space, the latent space dimension. It makes a lot of assumptions, and the job is on the experiment to match those assumptions. That's the old framework. Design an experiment so we can use these tools. So
okay.
I don't mean to, yeah.
No, and that is also, I mean, those are in our, I mean, I'm not a clinical trialist. There's a lot that goes into designing a clinical trial, especially the very large ones, right? That are, that are going to be the foundation for evidence-based medicine. But what I want to kind of like hone in on is that we come into the trial and we come into this experiment with a frequentist approach, meaning that we don't really see RCTs try to invoke prior beliefs from whether that be preclinical data or other smaller trials that have, whether they be observational trials or whatever, case studies, those kind of things, right? So an RCT is completely frequentist in its approach, and that's considered gold standard. And my understanding of frequentists is that the one advantage that frequentists cite as being their advantage is that they're able to minimize their long-term error in terms of, that is, you're smiling because I know that's maybe, there's some evidence that would suggest otherwise, but the claim of frequentists is that an RCT can mitigate some of the errors in other approaches. And that's why it's considered so rigorous in clinical medicine. And then we take, as clinicians, the conclusions of an RCT, and then we use those as in priors for as how we apply when we go to actually apply medicine. And we apply medicine now in a more, I think maybe two things we said we touch frequentists and we have Bayesian and likelihood approaches, right? And I think clinicians tend to use these more often when they are treating patients and they are walking through a differential than just looking at observational data and saying, I think likelihood of you have heart failure is the likelihood of having heart failure in the whole population of the United States, right? So I think that's maybe a place we can kind of launch off into discussion as to these how medicine is practiced with these methods of inference versus how the data that we use is generated with a more frequentist approach, and and how can we take bits and pieces and put them together.
I think that's a great discussion for our next session. Absolutely, I think we've laid the groundwork for some good discussions there. So we are at about 40 minutes. We figured we'd just get people interested in the discussion so that they'll come watch the next one. But we'll keep this conversation going with the next video. Does that sound good, Gail?
Yeah. So maybe next.
Yeah. So we'll kind of put a marker here and say stay tuned for the next one. We'll talk a little bit more. We'll start getting more and more concrete about how each of these components come in and help us as physicians. And then I think one of the most exciting things that we'll talk about is how do machine learning tools come in and help us as physicians do the job now that we've laid out the different stages of inference. Anything else y'all want to add before we close out this session?
No, I think that's great. I think this was really nice. This was good for me because it's the first time I've really thought deeply about what a differential diagnosis actually means, and it's starting to give me ideas about ways that medical training I think shapes the form of our decision making to make us more efficient. So this has been really, really kind of fun conversation for me.
I absolutely agree. I think it's for me, formalizing some of these approaches in medicine, whether that be a Bayesian approach, a likelihood approach, and a frequentist approach, and seeing where in medicine do we use these different approaches, can help us one, improve them, right? If we know we're using a certain approach here, we can ask, is the approach, is it appropriate? Is it the best approach? Are there other approaches that we can formalize and use as well? So I'm excited to definitely move forward and begin applying this stuff. We can discuss, next time we meet, how to begin applying these approaches in clinical inference.
Absolutely. Great. Awesome. Well, hopefully y'all will tune in next time.